When I was a kid, I gave my parents a lot of grief. On a surface level, I kind of came across as a bit of a goody two-shoes. But the truth is, I was just smart enough and just clever enough to get away with a whole lot of stuff that I probably shouldn't have gotten away with. Now, my kids, as a result, get away with nothing. That's the honest truth. God bless them. If it weren't bad enough that they're raised as pastors' kids, they're growing up with a father who grew up having tried everything and gotten away with most things. There's no lie that they can tell that I haven't already told. There's no sneak that they can sneak that I haven't already snuck. And so the end result is that whenever they're trying something, I can always smell a rat. I'll never forget when our daughter, Sarah, she's in her mid-20s now. She was in junior high, I think grade 7 or grade 8. She came home from school one day. I was standing in the kitchen, and she sat across the room from me and crossed her legs. And I noticed as she crossed her legs, I could see a little ballpoint pen ink down around her ankle. And so I just kind of took a flyer, took a wild guess. So, Sarah, would you like to tell your teacher that you cheated on your test today, or would you like me to tell your teacher that you cheated on your test today? Her jaw hit the floor. Her eyes said it all. How did you know? Takes one to know one, right? She was a good girl. She took a big breath. I'll tell her. And she did. It's not that I want to be a killjoy for my kids. I'm not trying to take all their fun away. It's just that I, like most good parents, am trying to help my kids avoid some of the same mistakes that I made growing up. In fact, some of the best conversations that I have with my kids are ones in which I get to share with them some of the mistakes that I've made, some of the roads that I've traveled, some of the ditches that I've been in. Because Lord knows, I have driven my life into a few ditches. And my hope is, again, not to take away all their fun, but to hopefully help them avoid some of the same regrets, some of the same heartache, some of the same hard roads that I have had to experience in my life because of some of the decisions that I've made. Now, just because I give them this information and I share with them all this wisdom and insight, there's no guarantee that they're going to take it, right? I mean, the truth is, some people just have to learn things for themselves. I'm sure that some of you here today can relate to that, right? Some of you probably, no matter how much people warn you about certain decisions or things that you might do, no matter how much they warn you, you still have to figure it out for yourself. Anyone here like that? Lots of hands going up. Good. Some of you just simply have to learn your lessons the hard way, right? It's a fact of matter, a matter of fact that many of us do have to experience things in spite of the warnings that we're given. Today we're going to be starting a new series called 5 Ways to Wreck Your Life. And some of you are here today having probably already done a pretty good job of wrecking some things in your life. In fact, you might be here today because you're hoping that there's some way that you can unwreck some things that perhaps you've wrecked. Maybe some of you are here today because you've seen other people wreck their lives, and you're hopeful that maybe you can learn something during this series that might help you avoid some of the same mistakes and some of the pitfalls that some other people you've seen have made. The wisest man in the world once said, "A wise person chooses the right road, a fool takes the wrong one." Now, I don't know what your spiritual or your church background is. You may be a person who's been reading the Bible your whole life, or you may have never cracked it open. You may still be wrestling with whether or not there's a real God, or that this Jesus person was actually a real person that lived. You may only be here today because somebody promised to bring you to a movie and they got you here this morning, and surprise, it's church. And maybe they're trying to tell you something about the road that you are traveling in your life. Regardless of what your church background is, regardless of where you are in your faith journey and your spiritual life, here's one thing that I'm sure we can all agree upon, and that is this: all of us want to be the wise person who takes the right road. None of us want to be the fool that wrecks our lives. Nobody sets out in life with a plan to make bad choices and wreck their lives. So regardless of where you are today, here's one thing that I want to assure you. That even though you may feel like you've already done some pretty good wrecking, maybe you feel like, you've had more than just a few fender benders in life, perhaps your life could be a write-off. Here's one thing that I believe, and I want you to embrace this belief with me, and that is this: as long as your heart is still beating and there is still breath in your lungs, it is never too late to get off the wrong road and get on the right road. as long as you have not been placed in a box yet 6 feet under, as long as you're still upright or reasonably upright, it is not too late for you to get off the wrong road and to get onto the right road. We believe here at Grasslands that God has given us a road map. We call it the Bible. We believe that if we can learn how to read this map and we can follow its directions, that it leads us to a place of experiencing what Jesus referred to as abundant life. It's a rich life. It's a full life. It's a life that begins now and lasts for all eternity. Now, that same wise person that I quoted just a moment ago is a great contributor of this roadmap. In fact, his name is King Solomon, and he wrote several of the books that we have in our Old Testament, of the Old Testament of what we call the Bible, this roadmap. And what we're going to be doing through this series is actually exploring some of the things that Solomon, King Solomon, this super wise guy, shares with us. Now, you can take my word for the fact that Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived, or you can take the Bible's word for it, okay? But just so that you know, virtually every major world religion views Solomon as having had a supernatural wisdom, something that set him apart from everyone else. That's roughly 80 to 85% of the world's population. So it's a pretty safe bandwagon for you to jump on as we begin this series, that Solomon is a very wise person, and the things that he's going to be teaching us through this series are full of extreme wisdom. In fact, you might say that we might be fools to not follow his advice. Now, what we're going to be doing as we read through one of the books in particular, which is called the book of Ecclesiastes, is we're going to be looking at some warnings that Solomon gives to us about some big mistakes that he made in his life. In fact, the whole book is basically a book of warnings. Don't do what I did. And that might make you question whether or not he really was all that wise. Well, if he's the wisest person in the world, how did he make all these mistakes? How did he make so many mistakes that he could write a whole book about it? And I would just tell you this, just like we've already sorted out before, just because you have the knowledge or you have the wisdom or you have the information doesn't necessarily mean that you always apply the knowledge and apply the wisdom and apply the information. And so Solomon, like any good parent, is sharing with us to try to help us avoid some of the same pitfalls that he experienced in his life. Now, we're going to begin reading this book of Ecclesiastes this morning, and I'm going to share some things with you. The first thing we're going to do is something that I never do when I read a book, and I read a lot of books. I read probably between 35 and 50 books a year, and I can only remember doing this once in my entire life, and that is actually turning to the end of the book and reading the last part first. I don't even remember why I did it that one time that I did it. I hear that there are some people that are kind of weird that way, that like to read the last chapter or the last page before it's over so that, they know exactly where things are headed. I don't usually do that. But we're going to do that today as we begin reading Ecclesiastes because Solomon makes a statement at the end of this book that really provides for us a lens through which we're going to read all the other stuff that he's written. This is what he writes in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 13, the very end of the book. He says, "Here now is my final conclusion. Fear God and keep his commands, for this applies to every person." Fear God and keep his commands, for this applies to every person. Now, this is the closing statement of 12 chapters after all that Solomon has shared with us, which many of you might not even know what he shared with us yet. We'll get there, trust me. But all the stuff that he's done, all the things that he's experienced, he sums it all up in this one specific statement. Everything that Solomon writes up to this point is, again, this big message to us, a big red flag that says, don't do what I did. Don't do what I did. If you follow my footsteps, if you go down the same road that I traveled, you will wreck your life. That's essentially what he is telling us here. He basically says that a life apart from God is not going to help you. It's not going to be what you're looking for. Now, Solomon's life was marked with great regret. He got to the end, and he did have a lot of messes that he could look back on and see how he had made some very poor choices and traveled down some really wrong roads. What makes his story that much more tragic is that his life started out with great promise. Solomon's life is chronicled in the book of 1 Kings, which is in the Old Testament of the Bible. You can read his whole story there. He was the second child, the second son of King David and Bathsheba. King David was the greatest king that ever ruled over Israel. He was considered to be the great king whose heart was attached to God's heart. He was a man after God's own heart. And so when Solomon took over leading the nation of Israel, Solomon had some pretty big shoes to fill. And at the beginning of Solomon's story, at the beginning of his leadership over Israel, we see that he exercised some great humility. He actually lowered himself before God, was very humble, and the end result of that was that God gave Solomon incomparable wisdom. This wisdom that Solomon had was a gift from God. And in addition to being incomparably wise, he was also unimaginably wealthy. He was, at the time, the wealthiest man in the world. His wealth then may have made him the wealthiest man to live on our planet today by comparison. But just because things got off to a good start with Solomon, there was no guarantee that he was going to have a good finish. You might have heard me say that before. A good start is no guarantee of a good finish. Because as Solomon began exercising his leadership over the nation of Israel, and as he began to drift away from the initial footsteps that his father had laid out for him, he began to fear God less. He began to respect God and follow God less. He began to be full of pride. He got too big for his britches. And the end result was that instead of staying on the straight road that God had paved for him, he began to take a few alternative routes. He began to take some detours, some side roads. And those side roads that he took led to his life being a total train wreck. So we've read that his conclusion to the decisions that he's made is that we need to fear God and we need to obey God. But what I want to do is look at the beginning of the book now and see how he sets the whole thing up. Now, I told you I'm an avid reader. I read, in a good year, I'm reading a book a week. I actually buy more books than I actually read. And I know that that's probably a waste of money. I used to actually feel guilty about it. Every book that I read or I bought, I would read from the very beginning all the way to the very end. And then I realized that every once in a while I would pick up a real stinker. And I felt guilty about having spent 10 or 15 bucks on it or whatever it was, so I would force myself to read the whole thing. And it would take me 2 or 3 times longer to read those books that I wasn't enjoying or that I wasn't getting anything out of than it would take me to read something that I was enjoying. And I realized a couple of years ago, it wasn't just a waste of money. Now you're wasting your time too, and time is money. So now I have a policy that if I'm reading a book, if I'm not captured by the end of the first chapter, I toss it. I'm done. If you're a writer and you want to get my attention, you've got to get it in the very beginning of the book. If you don't have me by the end of the first chapter, our relationship is done. I'm not reading your book. Of course, you've already got my money, so I guess the joke is on me, but I'm not going to waste any more of my time with you. Now, when Solomon penned this book, Ecclesiastes, had he been so wise as to hire me to be his editor, I would have probably given him a little bit different direction in terms of the opening of the book, the way that he started the book. Let's take a look at the way he opened his book. Ecclesiastes chapter 1, verse 1, the words of the teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem. He's establishing who he is, that this is him writing. Meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher. Utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. Now, get up in the morning and I hop onto Facebook like all of you do too. And if I see one of those types of status updates hit my newsfeed, unfollow. I consider myself somewhat of I'm more of an upbeat, glass half full kind of guy. I have a hard time with this negative stuff. And we can see right off the bat that Solomon's getting this thing started on a bit of a negative angle here. I mean, the guy's in desperate need of some counseling. There is no doubt about it. Meaningless, meaningless, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. He loves this word meaningless. In fact, he's going to use it more than 30 times throughout the book. It comes from the Hebrew word habel. He loves this word habel. Habel has a variety of different meanings or interpretations from the Hebrew. It's important that we get our heads around this word because we're going to be hearing it a lot over the course of the next few weeks. This word habel has a number of connotations. It can mean something like emptiness, futile. It can mean nothing or useless or worthless or even a delusion. And so every time Solomon hits on this word, he's basically telling us that things as he sees them are empty, futile, worthless, meaningless. If you don't get it right, if you don't travel the right road, you're going to get to the end and you're going to look back and you're going to see nothing but emptiness, nothing but uselessness. Now, I don't know about you, but I know that one of these days I'm going to be buried in the ground and somebody's going to go make me a nice fancy tombstone. If you really love me, it'll be a great big monument. And on it, you're going to engrave something, my epitaph, I don't know. But what I don't want it to say, and I know this clearly, you write this down if you're a note taker, I do not want it to say, here lies Bart, his life was meaningless. Here lies Bart, his life was futile. Although it feels that way sometimes. Here lies Bart, his life was empty. That is not what I want to look back on my life to see. I am sure that you do not want to look back on your life and see that it was meaningless, futile, empty, worthless, nothing. We want to know that our lives mattered for something, that we've made some kind of impact. And so Solomon, as an old man, is looking back on his own life, and he's essentially saying that, look, a life apart from God is empty. A life apart from God is meaningless, it's empty, it's futile, it's worthless. He says it's like chasing the wind. Picture that for a moment. You can chase the wind all day long. Can you catch it? And if you do, what do you have once you've caught it? I'm pretty sure it's nothing. It's empty. I think that Solomon, as he lived his life, in spite of his wealth, in spite of his wisdom, in spite of all the privilege that he had in his life, there was some sort of emptiness that he was experiencing. And what he lays out for us in this book, what he details for us, are all of the things that he tried, all the roads that he traveled, all the experimentation that he did to try to fill that void, to fill that emptiness that he was experiencing. He's actually going to lay out for us 5 different ways that he tried to fill that void in his life. And what he warns us is that if those are the same things that we chase in life, and we're chasing them for the same reason that he chased them, we're going to get to the end and we're going to look back and we're going to see that we have wasted our time, that we chased the wind and we've come up empty. How many of you have experience with one of these? A lot of you? Hands up, just so I know. Okay, almost everybody in the room has played with one of these at one point. This is, one of those, these things have been around for decades. And this is one of those, childhood formation toys, This is one of those basic building blocks of teaching your kids how to use their motor skills and cognitive thinking. Now, when you first give one of these to one of your children, the first thing they do is suck on the yellow pieces, right? You're with me on that. They suck on it, they get it all drooly, and it's all nasty. Or they shake it while you're trying to watch the football game, and it's really annoying. Okay? That's the first thing to do. Eventually, you as a good parent begin to demonstrate for them that it's not for eating and it's not for shaking, but we take the pieces and we find the corresponding holes and we put them in and then we clap. Yay, right? Don't we all do that? Come on, that's what you do, right? And so our kids, they take the pieces and of course, when they're first learning, they just find any hole there and they start trying to jam it in. And it doesn't really matter where they try to put it. If it's not corresponding to the proper hole, it never goes in. Now, I reason that a lot of the life wrecking that we do as human beings in our lives is when we spend our time trying to fill the void or the emptiness or the holes in our lives with pieces that simply don't fit. And it doesn't matter how hard we push or how much we twist, how much effort we put into it. As long as the piece and the hole don't correspond with one another, it's not the same size and the same shape, then it's a meaningless Hebel exercise. I can't find the one that this goes in. There it is, right? And I think that a lot of us, that's what we experience in life. That's what Solomon experienced in life. He had this hole, this vacuum, this emptiness in his life, and he spent all this time trying to fill this void, and he was trying to shove in things that weren't ever going to fill that void because it was the wrong size and it was the wrong shape. And as a result of doing that, Solomon made some decisions in his life that wrecked his life. And some of those decisions wrecked his family. And some of those decisions wrecked his leadership and the entire nation of Israel. And I think that a lot of you could probably relate to that because a lot of us have made decisions in our lives. We've chased after things. We've wrecked our own lives, and there's always collateral damage to that, right? There are always other people and other relationships that we end up hurting or wrecking in the process. Some of you may be on the reverse side of that. Maybe you're the person that is suffering because of someone else's recklessness, because of someone else's own life wrecking. In my late 20s, I began following Jesus. I got off the wrong road. I got on the right road. Now, I had grown up in church. I was a kid who grew up in a Christian family and went to a Christian church my whole life. And I knew everything that I needed to know about being a Christian. I just wasn't being one. I had the map, just wasn't choosing to follow the map, right? And eventually I wised up and I began following the map, and I understood that God wanted to have a relationship with me, and I changed the road that I was on. And as I was doing that, I started doing a Bible study with a buddy of mine. And in this Bible study we were doing, there were a lot of different Bible verses that we were supposed to memorize. And I'll be honest with you, I'm not a very good Bible memory kind of guy. It's just not one of my strengths. But there was one verse that I had to memorize during the course of that Bible study that stuck with me. It's one that I've never forgotten. And interestingly, it was written by King Solomon himself. It's from Proverbs chapter 3. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not depend on your own understanding. Seek his will in all you do, and he will show you which path to take." Trust God. Trust God, and he'll show you the right road. It's interesting to me how Solomon, early in his life, understood this principle. He understood that living a life dependent on God, trusting in God, living his life honoring God and being obedient to God would lead him to the wise road. Remember, the wise person chooses the right road, and I just have to read into this that the wise person is the one listening for God's instruction, for God's direction. The fool is the one that takes the wrong road. The fool is the one, I think, who blocks out God's voice and ignores God's leadership. Somewhere along the way, Solomon stopped taking his own advice. He stopped listening to God's voice. He got off of God's road, and he began pursuing things on his own terms. We're going to take a look now at the second chapter of Ecclesiastes. We're going to take a couple of minutes here today to look at one of the specific roads that Solomon traveled that he promises us will wreck our lives if we follow. In fact, if you want to wreck your life, Solomon says this. He says, let pleasure drive you. Let the theme song of your life be self-satisfaction, self-indulgence, fun, pleasure, leisure, excitement, eat, drink, and be merry. Let the pursuit of happiness be your God. You do those things, you will almost assuredly end up wrecking your life. And that for a season is exactly what Solomon did. Instead of letting his life orbit around God and his relationship with God, he began to let his life orbit around the things that gave him pleasure, this pursuit of pleasure. Look what he says in Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 1. I said to myself, come on, let's try pleasure. Let's look for the good things in life. But I found that this too was meaningless. It was Hebel. It was empty. Now, there were no limits that Solomon would and could go to experience pleasure. He had everything he wanted, everything he needed, all the privilege in the world at his fingertips. We as human beings, when we tend to live out our lives based on our gut instincts, the natural instincts that we have in us, people might refer to them as animal instincts. I would simply say the things that drive us, when we separate ourselves from the spiritual formation that God is trying to do in our lives, the things that drive us are feed me, sex me, entertain me. Those are the things that we naturally gravitate towards. Those are the things that naturally drive us. And as men, we clearly typically put way too much emphasis on the sex me part of this. Solomon did. Let's take a look at what he did. In 1 Kings chapter 11, it says, "Now Solomon loved many foreign women. Besides Pharaoh's daughter, he married women from Moab, Ammon, Edom, Sidon, and from among the Hittites. The Lord had clearly instructed the people of Israel, you must not marry them, because they will turn your hearts to their gods. Yet Solomon insisted on loving them anyway. He had 700 wives of royal birth and 300 concubines, and in fact, they did turn his heart away from the Lord." It appeared to me that for a season of Solomon's life, there was probably not a woman that he met that didn't end up in his bedchambers. And as we continue to read the text there in 1 Kings, it goes on to explain just how badly this grieved God, how much this impacted Solomon's relationship with God, because Solomon, he wasn't following God's road here. He wasn't following the wise choice. He chose his own road. He took the fool's way. In verse 2, he continues the text and says, "So I said, laughter is silly. What good does it do to seek pleasure? And after much thought, I decided to cheer myself with wine. And while still seeking wisdom, I clutched at foolishness. In this way, I tried to experience the only happiness most people find during their brief life in this world." I picture Solomon here sitting in his lazy boy in his basement, binge-watching episodes of How I Met Your Mother with a bottle of booze in his hand. And for a moment, he's trying to fill this void, this emptiness of his life by just laughing along with the laugh track of life. If I'm entertained enough, if I laugh enough, if I get enough joy out of this entertainment, then maybe that will fill this void. And we know that that never will. And when that didn't work, he turned to alcohol. He turned to drinking. Now, for a time, that might have numbed his sensation of emptiness. It might have distracted him from the fact that his life was vacant, that there was something missing. But when he sobered up in the morning, the hole was still there. We got to know that entertainment and self-medication are never going to be the solution to filling this void, this hole that we have in our lives. Feed me, sex me, entertain me. And too many of us have relied on those things to filling that void. Too many of us have seen others in our lives wreck their lives by allowing those things to be their primary pursuit. My son Silas was watching a Netflix movie the other night, the movie Holes. Any of you seen that movie? It's a really cute movie based on a children's novel. I remember watching it, 10 or 11 years ago when it first came out. And it stars a very young Shia LaBeouf. He was just a kid at the time that he made the movie, and he's gone on to make many, many blockbuster films. He's an adult now. He's the guy that's in all the Transformer movies. I remember a couple of years ago, Shia LaBeouf, in spite of all this great stardom that he had attained with all these movies that he made, he was in the news frequently for having done some really goofy and weird stuff. I can't even really describe some of the things that he was doing. He'd plagiarized some writing, and he was doing all this weird performance art stuff. He was making weird decisions that, as I read about it, looked to me like he was wrecking his life and wrecking his career. He was the butt of a lot of jokes and doing a lot of strange things. And then as I began to process it, I realized that Shia LaBeouf might have been doing what so many of us do, which is trying to fill a void or a hole in his life with pieces that didn't exactly fit. Listen to what he said in an interview in Parade magazine. "Sometimes I feel I'm living a meaningless life, and I get frightened. I know I'm one of the luckiest dudes in America right now. I have a great house, my parents don't have to work, I've got money, I'm famous, but it could all change, man. It could go away, you never know. I don't handle fame well. Most actors on most days don't think they're worthy. I have no idea where this insecurity comes from, but it's a God-sized hole. If I knew, I'd fill it, and I'd be on my way." Gosh, the hard part of that is that he's nailed it on the head, right? It's a God-sized hole. And until we figure out how to fill that hole with God, we're going to continue experiencing this emptiness. How many of us in this room, how many people are we connected to that are experiencing that same vacancy, that same emptiness? We know that Solomon did. He continues in the text in verse 4 by saying, I also tried to find meaning by building huge homes for myself and by planting beautiful vineyards. I made gardens and parks, filling them with all kinds of fruit trees. I built reservoirs to collect the water to irrigate my many flourishing groves. Solomon's life turned into like HGTV on steroids. His construction project was one of the most elaborate imaginable. He was an HGTV producer's dream. He created reality TV for years and years. Now, interestingly, Solomon had been tasked with the responsibility of building the temple in Jerusalem. David, his father, had wanted to build the temple, but God said, no, I'm going to hold that off for your son Solomon. So Solomon spent 7 years of his life constructing the temple in Jerusalem, which would be the epicenter of worship for the entire nation of Israel. It was beautiful, it was elaborate, it was complicated. And for 7 years, Solomon labored over building that. And then when it was done, he turned around and spent 13 years building his own home. Gives you a pretty good indication that he had his priorities misaligned. He continues in the text, verse 7, by saying, I bought slaves, both men and women, and others were born into my household. I also owned large herds and flocks, more than any of the kings who lived in Jerusalem before me. I collected great sums of silver and gold, the treasure of many kings and provinces. I hired wonderful singers, both men and women, and had many beautiful concubines. I had everything a man could desire. So I became greater than all who had lived in Jerusalem before me. And my wisdom never failed me. Anything I wanted, I would take. I denied myself no pleasure. I even found great pleasure in hard work. Lest you think that it's all about fun and games and sex and entertainment. He worked hard to find pleasure in the things that he was doing. But as I looked at everything I'd worked so hard to accomplish, it was all so meaningless. Like chasing the wind, there was nothing really worthwhile anywhere. Many of you know that I am a diehard Dallas Cowboys fan. I grew up in Dallas. I heard some woo-woos. That's good, yeah. No boos and hisses. I want to hear the Rough Riders fans can just be silent for the day, right? It's one of those seasons, isn't it? I grew up in Dallas, in the Dallas area. I don't remember ever a time in my life that I wasn't a Dallas Cowboy fan, which means I've been a Dallas Cowboy fan through all the good times and all the bad times because I'm a true fan. I'm hanging on even when things aren't going so well, just like all you Rough Rider fans are hanging on right now, right? Not a good year for you. Now, when you're a true fan of a team, of a sports team, not just a casual fan, not just a bandwagon fan, but when you're a true fan, you tend to live and die. Your hopes rise and fall on the players that are brought in by the general manager and the coach. And one of the things, if you're a true fan, that you really pay attention to is the character and the quality of the individual that this player is, right? Their personalities, their character, it shapes the character of the team. And as a real fan, that's something that's really important to you. Now, I will never forget when in 1994, the Dallas Cowboys signed none other than prime-time Deion Sanders. You may or may not know anything about Deion Sanders, but let me tell you a little bit about prime-time Deion Sanders. He gave himself the nickname Prime-Time, which ought to tell you a little bit about his personality. Now, he's an unbelievable athlete, maybe one of the greatest athletes that ever played pro football. He actually was a professional baseball player, played Major League Baseball at the same time that he was playing in the NFL. That was a hard one for me to get over because this guy had an ego the size of Alberta. Like, it was huge. This guy was so full of himself. Now, the Cowboys would go on and actually win a Super Bowl with Deion Sanders as a part of their team, and he would eventually be inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Now, I'm a big fan of Deion Sanders. He does broadcasts on the weekends. He works for the TV stations that broadcast the games, and he's often on TV, and now I'm a fan. I wasn't always a fan, and I was even struggling with it while I was while I was with the Cowboys. But here's the thing, is that while he did once play for God's team, he is now a part of God's family. And so while I have this connection with him as always having been a Cowboys fan, and once a cowboy, always a cowboy, he'll always be a cowboy to me, we now have this connection because now he's not just part of my team, he's a part of my family. You see, Deion Sanders, he changed roads. He got off the wrong road, he got onto the right road. He made Jesus the North Star of his life, and that's something that we're now connected in. But I want you to listen to an excerpt from his faith story. He says, I remember winning the Super Bowl that year, and that night after the game, I was the first one out of the locker room, the first one to the press conference, and the first one to go home. And I remember my wife, Carolyn, saying to me, baby, you just won the Super Bowl. Don't you have a party downstairs or something to go to? And I just said, nah. And I rolled over and I went to sleep. That was the same week I bought myself a brand new $275,000 Lamborghini. And I haven't even driven a mile before I realized, nope, that's not it. That's not what I'm looking for. It's got to be something else. I'm so hungry. I tried everything, parties, women, buying expensive jewelry and gadgets, and nothing helped. There was no peace. I mean, I was playing great. I got all this media attention and everything the world has to offer, but no peace, no joy, just emptiness inside. The Bible describes it in the first chapter of Ecclesiastes as chasing after the wind, and that's exactly what it was like. I tried to buy myself something to make me happy, and I was even emptier than before because I could see that nothing could possibly satisfy the hunger that was deep down inside of me. You see, when I read that story, when I hear Deion's story, I'll tell you what smacks me right between the eyes is the statement where he says, I could have everything, but I had no peace. I tried everything, but I had no peace. Yeah, you see, I think like Deion, many of us, that's ultimately what we're wrestling with, is a lack of peace. I think that was Solomon's issue. I think that's Shia LaBeouf's challenge. It's a lack of peace. And without having a clear understanding as to how to attain this peace, we simply pursue things that we think will make us happy. And the things that we pursue, the things we chase that we think will make us happy might make us happy, but they don't give us peace. Peace can't come from pleasure. It doesn't come from wealth. It doesn't come from entertainment. It doesn't come from sex or from alcohol. It doesn't come from having a super fit body or a great job or a big house. Those things don't bring peace. In fact, often those things that we pursue that could bring us happiness will often completely undermine our ability to get peace. Because the peace that we're really looking for is a peace found in a relationship. It's peace between us and God, the one who created us, the one who made us, the one who made us for a relationship with him. And if we don't have that peace, we're never going to find peace. If you're a person who ever uses the phrase, if only I had a better job, if only we could have kids, if only I was married, if only we had a bigger house, if only I could lose these 20 pounds. If you use that qualifier to describe how you could have a more satisfying life, I might challenge you to take a good, long, hard look at the size and the shape of the hole in your life that you are trying to fill. Or maybe you think in these terms, when blank happens, then I'll be happy. When I finally finish school and have my degree, then I'll be happy. When I finally get to retire and I don't have to go to this humdrum job anymore, then I'll be happy. When I finally meet that special someone and I don't have to search for my soulmate anymore, then I'll finally be happy. When I finally get that promotion at work and I'm his boss, then I'll be happy. I'm going to give you one statement here today, and if you don't walk away with anything else, I want you to remember this. If you're a note taker, write this down. And if you're not a note taker, I suggest you write this down. Okay? When your peace or your happiness or your hope is tethered to something temporary, then your happiness and your hope will always be temporary. I'll say that again. When your happiness or hope is tethered to something temporary, then your happiness and your hope will always be temporary. See, happiness is based on our external circumstances, and external circumstances change all the time. And so when we're depending on those things to bring us happiness, we can lose them at any time. But peace, this peace that we're really searching for, is something that transcends temporary. It's eternal. Finding true peace begins with filling the hole in our lives with the one peace that truly fits. And we need to fill it with God. We need to fill it with a relationship with God. Philippians chapter 4, Paul writes this, "Do not be anxious about anything. Don't worry. I know you've got this wrestling match in your spirit. You've got this hole. You've got something inside there that you can't figure out, but don't worry." He says, in everything, by prayer and petition, talk to God. File a petition with thanksgiving. Present your requests to God. Talk to him about it. Tell him that you have this hole that you can't seem to fill. Tell him about this vacancy. Tell him about your lack of peace. And then the promise is that the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. God doesn't promise he's going to give you all the things that you think will make you happy. But he does promise that if you come to him as the source of filling that hole, filling that void, that he will give you a peace that you won't even understand. It transcends all understanding, and it will guard you from now and through eternity. Finding this happiness, this true happiness, begins with making peace with God. This is a really important thing because you got to remember that not everybody who's happy has peace. But everybody that I know who has that real peace is typically way more happy. I don't know if you've experienced that in your life, if you've seen that, but I know that people who I know who have that real peace, that true peace, they tend to be happy more than those who are constantly looking for those temporary things to make them happy. And it all starts with making peace with God. And we do that first and foremost by recognizing our need for him, by reorienting our life to pursue him. The Bible calls it repenting. It means changing your direction, recognizing you're on the wrong road, you're on the fool's road, and listening to God's call to get on the right road, the wise person's road. We make Jesus our North Star. We make him the primary focal point of our entire adventure, our entire life. That's the straight path. That's the one that leads to true peace. Now, some of you sitting here today, I'm sure are asking yourself the question, or maybe you just know clearly that you've never actually done that. You've never actually conscientiously said, okay, I need to change roads, and boom, road changed. Maybe this language about reorienting your life or Jesus is your North Star, maybe all that's like, woo, over my head. I have no idea what Pastor Bart's talking about here. Might be a little confusing, but here I don't have time to unpack that all today. But here's what I ask of you. If you're that person, if you're sitting here and you're wondering, have I ever really gotten off the wrong road and gotten onto the right road? Have I ever actually made peace with God? If you're asking that question, I want you to come back next week. In fact, I want you to come back every week of this series. Because every week of this series, we're going to peel back a little bit more, a few of the layers of this thing. By the time we get to the end of the series, you'll have all the information that you need to know whether or not you have made peace with God. You'll know everything. It's a money-back guarantee. If you stick with us for all 5 weeks, I'll give you all your money back if we get to the end and you haven't got it, okay? And some of you here are saying to yourself, well, that's all great, Pastor Bart, but I have made peace with God, yet I don't have peace. I have changed roads. I have repented, reoriented my life. I have made Jesus my North Star, and yet I'm still not experiencing this peace. Now, you may have a real faith, a genuine faith, a deep faith. There may not be anything wrong with your faith at all. Your problem might actually be related to obedience. Because if you remember, what Solomon said was that we need to fear God, meaning we need to revere him, we need to see him for all he is, we need to respect him, our life needs to center around him. But Solomon also said, and we need to obey him. And it's possible for you to have made peace with God and still not be living at peace with God because you're not living a life of obedience. What is God asking you to do? What does God want you to do? Does God want you to get baptized? Does God want you to go and repair a relationship, restore a relationship that's been damaged? Does God want you to serve in some specific ministry? Does he want you to build a relationship with a neighbor that you know needs a new relationship? Does he want you to give more sacrificially to the ministry that you're connected to here at Grasslands? I don't know. I don't know what that obedience is for you. I don't know what God's voice is telling you. But I will say that it is possible for you to have made peace with God and not be living at peace with God if you're not walking the road of obedience. Now, if that's you, here's what I want you to do. I want you to come back next week. The writer of Hebrews in the New Testament actually tells us that when the church gathers, when God's people get together, you should be there. Don't skip it. So, if you don't act out of any other obedience to God over the course of the next week, you can take one step of obedience simply by coming here on Sunday morning, spending time with a group of people who are all trying to figure out how to travel that same road that you want to be on. I'm going to be here. I sure hope you'll be here.